Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. It's the 24th of November, 1440. The great hall glows with candlelight, the long tables covered in platters of roasted meat, spiced wine, and sweet pastries. To any guest, it would have looked like a feast of peace. At the center of it all, two young nobles, barely more than children, were treated with every courtesy. William Douglas, just 16 years old, and his little brother David, only 10. They had come to Edinburgh at the invitation of Scotland's regent, a supposed gesture of reconciliation after years of feuding between rival factions. But this night would not be remembered for peace. Within hours, it would be burned into memory as the Black Dinner at Betrayal, so shocking that it shook Scotland to its core. How did a banquet, seemingly meant to heal wounds, turn into one of the most infamous massacres in European royal history? To understand, we have to step back and look at the fragile, violent Scotland of the 15th century. In 1437, Scotland was plunged into chaos. King James I had been assassinated in Perth, stabbed by conspirators while he hid in a sewer tunnel. His death left the throne to his son, James II, just 6 years old at the time. A child king meant instability. And in medieval Scotland, instability was an open invitation for the great noble families to make their move. Among these families, none were more powerful than the Douglases. Their reach was extraordinary. They held vast lands stretching from the English borderlands deep into Scotland's heart, and their private armies could match or even outnumber the king's own forces. For decades, the Earls of Douglas had been a law unto themselves, challenging the crown whenever it suited them. In many ways, they ran what was almost a state within a state. This was not just a nuisance, it was a direct threat to the very idea of a unified Scottish monarchy. And with a boy on the throne, that threat grew even greater. The family's power was left in the hands of two boys after tragedy struck. William Douglas, the 6th Earl, had fallen in battle back in 1424, leaving his earldom to his sons, William and David. Both were still children. The responsibility of raising and guiding them fell to their great-aunt, Margaret Douglas, the famous Fair Maid of Galloway. Margaret was no naive caretaker. She was shrewd, ambitious, and politically sharp. With her guidance, the young brothers inherited not just land and titles, but a network of loyal soldiers and fortified castles scattered across Scotland. Think about that for a moment. Two boys, still learning to ride and fight, were technically masters of armies and territories that could rival the king himself. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster is exactly what the regent of Scotland at the time, Sir William Crichton, saw coming. Crichton was Chancellor of Scotland and one of the most influential men in the kingdom. He was experienced, ruthless, and absolutely determined to strengthen the monarchy by cutting down the overgrown branches of noble power. To him, the Douglas brothers weren't just children of privilege, they were a looming danger, heirs to a dynasty that could tear the crown apart. At first, Crichton tried the usual methods. He suggested alliances through marriage. He offered favors and bribes to Douglas supporters. He even considered the possibility of taking the family on militarily, but nothing worked. The Douglas hold was simply too strong. Their lands, their castles, and above all, the loyalty of their men made them untouchable. Then came 1439, a turning point. William Douglas, now 15, was formally invested as the 7th Earl of Douglas. The ceremony was no small affair. Thousands attended. Nobles from across Scotland, emissaries from abroad, and loyal retainers all came to witness the moment. The sheer scale of the event sent a clear message. The Douglas family saw themselves not beneath the crown, but equal to it. To Crichton, that was unacceptable. The monarchy could not hope to survive if one family thought itself as great as the king. And so, he began to plan. If he could not weaken the Douglas family through politics or war, he would do it through something else entirely: deception. The idea was as simple as it was brutal. Invite the boys to Edinburgh Castle under the guise of friendship, offer reconciliation, promise peace. And then, once they were inside, cut them down. It was a plan dripping with risk. Scottish culture placed immense importance on the laws of hospitality. To harm a guest at your table was one of the darkest crimes imaginable, an insult not only to the victim, but to the entire society. Such an act could spark rebellion, even civil war. But Crichton decided it was a risk worth taking. The Douglases, in his eyes, had to go whatever the cost. The opportunity came in late 1440. Scotland was already simmering with disputes between noble houses. Using this tension as his pretext, Crichton extended an invitation to the Douglas boys. He framed it as a reconciliation dinner, a gathering where grievances would be set aside and unity restored. And to make the offer irresistible, he promised that young King James II himself would be present. That detail mattered. Meeting the king wasn't just an honor, it was a signal of legitimacy and safety. After all, no one would dare shed blood in front of the king, would they? The guarantees were airtight, or at least they seemed to be. Crichton swore that the gathering would be conducted under the sacred law of hospitality. For William and David Douglas, those words meant everything. They knew the risks. Advisors warned them that stepping into Edinburgh Castle could be a death trap, but faced with solemn assurances and the allure of standing alongside their king, the brothers decided to go. William at 16 was cautious but convinced. David at just 10 was nothing but excited. For him, this wasn't politics, it was an adventure. He would get to see the great castle, dine at the royal table, and meet the young king. The thought that it might all be a ruse never crossed his innocent mind. On the morning of November 24th, the Douglas brothers set out with a small escort. They passed through lands their family had ruled for generations, the familiar countryside offering them no hint of the treachery waiting ahead. Arriving at Edinburgh, they were received with all the dignity their rank deserved. Trumpets sounded, banners waved. The boys were ushered into the towering castle and led straight to the grand hall. At first, everything seemed exactly as promised. The tables groaned under the weight of food. The fire roared in the hearth. Young James II was indeed present, greeting the brothers warmly. The wine flowed. Conversation was lively. For William, the tension began to melt away. Perhaps his suspicions had been unfounded after all. Perhaps, just maybe, peace really was on the horizon. But peace was not what Crichton had in mind. As the evening wore on, subtle changes crept into the hall. More guards appeared, taking up positions by the doors. Armed servants moved about more frequently. Guests began slipping away quietly. None of this registered to the Douglas brothers, distracted as they were by the food, the music, and the rare chance to laugh with their king. Then came the moment. The main courses were cleared, the hall falling briefly into a hushed calm. Crichton rose from his seat, a goblet in hand, as though preparing to give a toast. Instead, he gave a signal. From the shadows, soldiers surged forward. The Douglas brothers had no time to react. One moment, they were honored guests at a royal banquet. The next, they were surrounded by steel. Soldiers, armed and ready, closed in around the table. William Douglas leapt to his feet. Instinctively, his hand reached for the hilt of his sword, but the weapon was gone. At some point during the dinner, perhaps when he had set it aside to sit comfortably, it had been quietly removed. He was unarmed, powerless, and trapped. Beside him, little David froze. The boy's excitement from earlier in the evening had evaporated in an instant. He clutched at his brother's sleeve, tears already filling his eyes. He didn't understand the politics, but he understood danger. The warm feast had turned into a nightmare. And then, in a scene that would haunt Scotland for centuries, the betrayal unfolded. The young king, James II, was there, only 9 years old himself. Seeing his friends, his peers, threatened so violently, he tried to intervene. But he was restrained by his own attendants, held back as soldiers dragged William Douglas from the table. The hall, moments earlier filled with laughter and conversation, now echoed with cries and the scuffle of boots on stone. The sacred law of hospitality, the unwritten code that guaranteed safety for any guest at a host's table, was being shattered in front of the entire court. William, barely 16, fought desperately. But he was outnumbered, pinned down by soldiers who showed no hesitation. Before the horrified eyes of his younger brother and his king, the young Earl of Douglas was executed, cut down not in battle, not in rebellion, but at a dinner table under a banner of peace. David was next. Only 10 years old, he was forced to watch as his brother was slain before him. His cries for mercy went unanswered. Moments later, he too was killed. It was done. 2 boys, heirs to one of Scotland's greatest dynasties, destroyed in a single night. The Black Dinner had claimed its victims, but the betrayal did not end with their deaths. Crichton and his allies had planned every step with cold precision. Within hours of the executions, royal soldiers fanned out across Douglas lands. Castles were seized. Supporters were arrested. Private armies were disbanded. The strategy was clear: cut off the head of the Douglas family and dismantle their power before anyone could resist. And in the short term, it worked. With their young lords gone, the Douglas household was thrown into chaos. But the shockwave that followed reached far beyond their clan. News of the massacre spread quickly, carried from village to village, castle to castle. And everywhere it reached, the reaction was the same: horror. This wasn't just about 2 noble boys. This was about trust. If the sacred law of hospitality could be broken so openly, what did that mean for everyone else? How could any noble, any envoy, any guest ever again believe that the king's table or any table was truly safe? Among those most devastated was Margaret Douglas, the boys' great aunt. She had raised William and David, protected them, and worked tirelessly to expand their influence. Now all of that was gone in a single night. Her grief was unimaginable. But grief quickly hardened into rage. Margaret began to rally allies, calling for vengeance. And allies were not in short supply. The Douglas family had long commanded loyalty from a wide network of noble houses. Even families that had once resented or opposed the Douglases were appalled by the treachery. Betrayal of guests was a line few were willing to cross, no matter how bitter their rivalries. Crichton had hoped the Black Dinner would weaken the Douglas cause. Instead, it gave them a unifying symbol: 2 murdered children, slaughtered under false pretenses, their blood crying out for justice. And then there was the king himself. Young James II, though not directly responsible, had witnessed everything. Imagine being 9 years old, sitting at your own banquet, only to see friends your own age dragged away and executed before your eyes. It left a mark he would carry for the rest of his life. The presence of the boy king that night was both a shield for Crichton, proof in his mind that the event was sanctioned, and a curse. For James, it was trauma. Historians often argue that the suspicion and mistrust James showed toward the nobility throughout his reign can be traced directly back to that moment at Edinburgh Castle. It shaped not just his personality, but the politics of Scotland for decades. By early 1441, Douglas supporters, fueled by grief and anger, had formed a coalition. This was no small rebellion. It was a movement that pulled together families who might otherwise have remained rivals. They marched under the banner of vengeance, determined to punish those responsible for the Black Dinner. The result was years of civil conflict. Battles raged across Scotland, castles changed hands, and villages suffered the fallout. Ironically, the very instability Crichton had claimed he was trying to prevent was exactly what his actions had unleashed. The monarchy, instead of being strengthened, was badly weakened. Its reputation was stained by association with dishonor. Trust in royal promises eroded, and Scotland, already fragile, descended deeper into division. In the centuries that followed, the story of the Black Dinner would be told and retold as a warning. Even in an age where power struggles were often brutal, there were lines one simply did not cross. And this betraying children under the cloak of hospitality was one of them. For medieval Scots, hospitality was sacred. It was the glue that allowed diplomacy, truces, and alliances to function. By breaking it so spectacularly, Crichton just murdered 2 boys. He undermined the very foundations of political society. And that's why the Black Dinner has echoed through history, not merely as a crime, but as a catastrophe of trust.